for asking me to be interviewed. I'll start off by telling you that I graduated from Franklin High School in Portland, Oregon in 1942, and I had actually gone to school previously in Amity, Oregon, a small town in the Willamette Valley, not far from McMinnville, but during my senior year in high school, my folks moved to Portland so my father could be a little closer to his insurance business. So I finally graduated from Franklin. I got a small scholarship to Oregon State College that paid my tuition for a year, and so I spent a year at Oregon State, 42 to 43, and during that time I enlisted in the Army, because in so doing I was able to complete that 1 year at Oregon State. So I was in the Army from mid-42 on, I think. The summer of 43, I worked in the shipyards in Portland, and then I was inducted into the Army in the fall of 1943, I think probably in September. I was inducted at Fort Lewis, Washington, spent about a week there. Various things. We were fitted with clothing and the equipment that we needed, and I think they did some IQ testing, as I recall, and then we traveled by train to Fort Benning, Georgia. And at Fort Benning, Georgia, we were in the infantry, and I took 13 weeks of basic infantry training at Fort Benning. I've really enjoyed it, even though it was tough training. We had experienced all sorts of things that an infantryman might encounter. Mainly it was training with the M1 rifle, which I loved from start to finish. After 13 weeks basic training at Fort Benning, I was transferred to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, into a regular infantry outfit, and spent I think 3 or 4 months, maybe as much as 5 months, getting advanced infantry training at Fort Jackson. And then in the fall, I think probably September of 1944, I went overseas with a group of infantry replacement men. And we sailed on the Mauretania, which was a big British vessel, had been part of the Cunard White Star Line. I think it was an old vessel. I think I remember reading that it had been constructed way back about the time of World War I. So it was probably 30 years old when it made this trip across the ocean. I think they made several trips. They probably took many thousand soldiers overseas. On the trip that I made, there were 8,000 servicemen aboard. The trip took about 7 days, I think, and it was an English vessel run by the English people, and food was terrible. Most people didn't even have a bunk. They slept on the deck or the floors or wherever they could find space. I remember sleeping on a table in the mess room. The food was terrible. English stuff was terrible. But we had no mishaps going over. They did zigzag the boat all the way across the ocean. I suppose they changed course about every half mile, and you could look back behind the boat and see the zigzag pattern that the ship had made. And they told us that the reason for this was to prevent a submarine from getting a bead on us. And they never did, of course. 7 days across the ocean, we were all mighty glad to get ashore. We landed in Liverpool, England. Liverpool's a big city on the west side of England. And shortly after arriving there, we were transported by train to a little camp down in the southern part of England. It's called Camp Delamere. And we were there for about 4 or 5 days, I think. And during that time, we were issued some cold weather equipment and boots and woolen clothing and so on. And then we were transported again by train to Southampton, England, which is right on the southern tip. We rode these little English cars which have entrances on each side. They open into a compartment, each of which held about 6, maybe 8 men. I'm not sure. But then once we got to Southampton, we boarded an English vessel. I think it was either a destroyer or a destroyer escort, and we boarded that thing at night. There were no sleeping arrangements on the vessel, so we just huddled on corners on the boat and traveled all night long. And by the next morning, we were just offshore at darn, interrupt that for a minute. I collect my thoughts.
Where you pick up where you interrupted your thought.
Okay, this English vessel took us across the English Channel to Omaha Beach, which is where some of the fiercest fighting had been on D-Day. D-Day was June 6, 1944, and we arrived and disembarked there probably in late September, possibly even October. As we walked up a big long hill there at Omaha Beach, there were German pillboxes all along the way, and you could easily see how the Germans had this entire beachhead covered with their artillery pieces, and why it was such a devastating landing for the GIs on that first day on June 6th. Up at the top of the hill, there was a flat spot there, the long hill, must be a half-mile long, I think. But we set up camp up at the top of this hill for 3 or 4 days, raining constantly, as I remember. And then we were picked up in the big Army trucks and taken over into eastern France. The fighting by that time was east of Paris. Paris had already been retaken by the Americans. The fighting was over, I recall, a town called Nancy, I think is where we disembarked. And then there was a series of what they called replacement depots, REPL depots they called them. And these were facilities where the GIs stopped off, and there was every sort of Army occupation soldier went through there. And for instance, if Company K of the 347th Infantry sent down word we need 5 riflemen, why they picked 5 riflemen out of the group that was going through. My own specialty was the 60 millimeter mortar, and at one of these REPL depots, one afternoon, I think we'd only been there a couple of days, here came a Jeep and a lone trooper, and he said, "You're joining the 106th Cavalry Recon Squadron." I thought, okay, I had no idea what that was, but he picked me up in his Jeep and took me up to where they were stationed in a forest called the Forêt de Peroy, F-O-R-E-T, de Peroy, heavily wooded forest. It was the weather was very rainy and muddy, and the unit had not moved for several days because of so difficult for the vehicles to get around. But I was assigned to this group and put up a tent there somewhere. The way this was set up was there would be a CP, a command post, back about 200 to 300 yards from the front line, and the soldiers would go up to the front line, usually two at a time, and that's where we alternated hours. Often it was 2 hours up and 4 hours back or something like that. But the very first night that I went up there, I think must have been the first day that I joined the outfit, I was with another man who'd been around for a while. And this was the front line, and during that evening, the Germans, not very far away, would fire their automatic weapons. They called them burp guns, and they'd go, and actually, that was the very first time I had bullets flying over my head, and I got kind of excited, I remember. But the guy next to me he'd been up there before. He says, he was pretty cool. He says, "That's all right. Don't fire back, because they're trying to get you to give away your position." So that went all right. We slept in. Sometimes when we were up there, we lay down in foxholes that were muddy and wet and dirty, and but we got through that part of it all right. However, it was about 2 weeks, I think, before the unit started to move, and then we moved on east toward Germany. I went out on a couple of patrols from that CP, that command post, and on one of them, a lieutenant took about 10 of us over toward the German lines. I think we were right on the German lines, or perhaps within them. Had to wade through some waist-deep water, I remember. And I was the second person in this patrol, and the guy up ahead of me, who was probably 20 feet ahead of me, stepped on a landmine which exploded under his feet and wounded him pretty badly. And at the same time, I felt a little something go into my shoulder, but I knew I was not badly hurt at all, and I didn't do anything about it. The lieutenant then called a halt to the patrol at that point because he felt there could be other landmines in the area, and he called some engineers up, and it took them maybe half an hour to get there. But these were guys with mine detectors on them, a round circular thing on the end of a handle. As they went along the ground, the thing would buzz if they came across any metal. And they walked right over a couple of mines which exploded and hurt them pretty badly.